Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to the Glacial Shield podcast. I'm Gil Aegis, your co-host, and my second co-host today is Winter. We've been out of commission for about the past month just because with work getting busy near the end of the year and with Christmas time and the holidays, we've just been figuring that it was probably best just to put it on pause until the new year. So we're back. Today's topic is going to be horror movies. We're going to discuss some of the classic horror movies that we can recall from when we were younger and probably our favorite one. We're going to discuss our favorite genre today and where some of the maybe the lesser ones don't work out as well as we'd like or we prefer. We're then going to discuss artsy horror and areas where that works for us and where it doesn't work for us. Uh, Next, we're going to discuss our preferred POV, whether it be children as like the main emphasis for the protagonists, or adults, or a mixture of both. Second to last, we're going to discuss horror television shows and maybe where one of us prefers it or doesn't prefer it. And lastly, we'll cap off our discussion with horror movies and potentially where they've jumped the shark for some movies. So right off the bat, Winter, when you were a kid, what's one of the most scariest horror movies you can recall?
So for me, I think of two horror movies immediately that I saw when I was fairly young. Most people call them fairly bad horror movies, but for me, I was a young kid. This was my first exposure. The first was Ghost Ship. Ghost Ship absolutely horrified me as a kid. Surprisingly, not the scene where everyone gets lopped in half. For some reason, that didn't bother me. What bothered me was when the characters all walk down into the ship and you see the little toy lift up in the air and shifts around to say welcome aboard. Bothered me when I was a kid. I can still visually see the scene in my head. Just awful. Rest of the movie, in fact, probably the entire movie wasn't that good. The other was Red Water, and that's a shark movie. Again, now that I've seen Jaws, nowhere near as good as Jaws, but that movie scarred me from going near the water for a while. And since I was a kid who grew up on a lake, I was a paddler, and I like to do things like water skiing and tubing. Wasn't so great to have the water become my enemy for a while. What about you?
It's really hilarious that you mentioned Ghost Ship. I can recall the movie when I was like a preteen, like 12 or 13, and that movie, that opening scene where the people that are on the ship getting so that opening scene where they just get cut in half, that really stuck out for me and probably scared the hell out of me for the longest time. Like you're right, not a good movie. Uh, but the scariest movie when I was a kid was Halloween H2O, Halloween 20 years later. And holy shit, that movie. I remember, it's so funny. I can remember my parents used to like tape different movies they'd rent and they'd record them, put them in our closet. And I found this movie one day. I said, "Oh, Halloween. That looks like such a fun movie." I put it in. I started watching it. It started like halfway through for some reason. Didn't rewind it. Classic VHSs. And it must have been when one of the people were in the dumbwaiter and they're trying to run away from Michael Myers and they just get stabbed and stabbed. And I can vividly remember the end of the movie where Michael Myers' head got chopped off by Jamie Lee Curtis and the head rolling down the hill. And I cried and I wailed and I was like petrified. My dad actually had to throw that copy of the tape in the wood furnace.
Well, you started off where your parents stopped watching it, is where you started. So probably where your mom or your dad got too scared.
No kidding. Yeah, but that's probably the one that's scariest for me. Maybe, I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the old one, was kind of frightening just because the buddy would put on like random faces of people that he killed. The Hills Have Eyes, just because it's another slasher, creepy movie. And maybe Wrong Turn was also a rough one. I can remember the girl standing in the tree or by a tree and she just got her head chopped off with the axe going right through her neck and then the body falling, but the head just staying on top of the like the hatchet handle.
And that's funny because I was going to say that when you first brought up Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it wasn't actually that gory of a movie. The original wasn't that bad.
No.
And even though it's considered gore porn these days, it left a lot to your imagination. I think we're going to talk about that a little later on about Jumping the Shark when it comes to gore porn type movies. But I also did enjoy those older ones a long time ago that didn't necessarily leave everything on the screen for you to see. It kind of left it for you to visualize it in your own head. But I'm jumping the shark myself a little bit here, so let's carry on. What is your favorite classic horror movie?
Okay, awesome. I love the movie It. I love the book It, the movie It, the old movie and the new movies. I think they really did a good job with the new one, especially with the child actors. they took some of the actors from prolific TV show Stranger Things from Netflix, which is also a good show, good horror show, but some of the child actors from that show are really good actors, and they're really good at portraying just like the fear and the horror elements in it. Pennywise is just he's a great villain. He can take the form of the children's fears, and I think that kind of means he's maybe Lovecraftian a little bit because he doesn't have a specified form. He can kind of like shapeshift. Uh, and the movies also incorporate different horror elements, whether they be simple jump scares to Pennywise using just like his ability to shapeshift into things that scared our characters the most, whether it's an evil clown or like gory, bloody porn, like gore porn and stuff, or an abusive father like for Beverly, or Mike's parents like dying, so like his fear of loss. What about you?
So I'm going to continue in a similar vein. My favorite horror movie is The Shining, which I will start right off the bat and say it's a shame because my favorite horror book is Doctor Sleep, and I was so excited when that got a movie, and unfortunately, I feel like the movie was a bit of a letdown. However, The Shining was my favorite horror movie. It was my favorite movie for a while. That's since switched to Saving Private Ryan. I really like that The Shining dealt with 3 to 4 central characters, depending on how you look at it, and it really leaned into a man going insane and having you not 100% sure whether there was an actual haunting, whether there was any actual horror going on outside of the main character. And for me, I enjoyed that side of the movie, kind of the questioning what was happening. I also thought it was very well acted, the slow build into the very intense action filled ending. Of course, the chase through the garden maze is very well known. Jack's frozen face, also Jack smashing his way through the door. But the movie built into that, and you got some very famous lines like Red Rum. Again, a decent child actor, even though I normally don't support child actors in movies. I felt the child actor in that movie portrayed the character fairly well. I am blanking on the name of the character right now. But overall, I thought The Shining was a great movie. I think it's also very good because it extends to people who don't necessarily like the genre. I know my mother was a big fan of the movie The Shining to the point where she read the book and she found the book significantly more disturbing than the movie, but still liked the book. And I think that's a great way for horror movies to work, to not only scare you, but also have a good plot thread, some deep thought context, and a little more than just trying to scare you to death. Um, and that's kind of where my favorite genre comes from, which is our secondary topic on this area. My favorite genre is spiritual or haunting type movies, followed up very closely by foreign zombie movies. Just to be clear, we're North American, so when I say foreign zombie movies, I mean things like Wreck, Train to Busan, or Kingdom, which is new on Netflix. Highly recommend anyone who has not seen it watch it. Great horror TV show. But on the spiritual vein, I'm thinking things like the original Amityville Horror, The Conjuring, or An American Haunting. I love horror movies that know how to get into your head. Very often have characters that you're questioning whether or not they're actually being haunted. I'm not someone who believes in ghosts in real life, so I like the context of, say, in Amityville Horror, where there is the implication that the father figure might just be insane, and the Phil, no, what was his name? DeFranco, the fellow in real life who killed his family, who said he heard voices. It's not necessarily he was really hearing voices. It might have been a symptom of his insanity, and these movies are showing you what they're seeing in their head, which I find fascinating. When it comes to The Conjuring, I just thought that The Conjuring through and through. I saw it actually at the movie theater last October, for the third time, I think, in my life. And the jump scares throughout the movie are well timed, well placed, very much psych you out. I brought a friend with me who basically told me at the end of the movie they were trying to guess throughout the entire movie when they were going to get jump scared, and they failed to figure it out every single time. And it was hilarious because I watched him jump more than once when you could see him preparing for 3 or 4 minutes for the jump scare. You could see him kind of getting tighter. You could see him kind of focusing in on the movie, and then it would psych him out. It would do a switch out, and he would get jumped anyway. Probably one of the only horror movies where I felt genuine jump scares. Worked well and also had a decent plot behind them. Again, the movie claims to be based on fact. Don't necessarily believe that, but it makes it more interesting. Um, Very briefly on zombie foreign horror movies, I'm not sure what it is, but I find Korean and Spanish zombie movies tend to be much more well done than American or North American in general horror. I'm not sure why. Maybe it's because um, the horror, especially the zombie movies, isn't gritty enough in North American horror. It doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel dirty. It doesn't feel down to earth. It feels very polished. It feels very Hollywood. And sometimes when you're watching a movie, especially a movie with something as gritty as a zombie, you don't want to feel that polish that comes from Hollywood. How about you, Aegis? What is your favorite horror genre?
I actually really like either spiritual horror or psychological horror. Psychological horror, I think, is really like it's interesting to see like some of your characters or your protagonists kind of like descend into madness. I think of Annabelle, where the new couple gets this doll, and the husband's always working, so the wife is home with the baby, and strange things start happening with the doll that the wife can't explain. And the husband, I don't think at the start believes her, but over time he does, just because he sees just how frantic and how like maddening it's making his wife. Uh,
Leo de
yeah, exactly. Um, like the frightening scenes, like used a lot of those movies are like really good at disturbing and unsettling both the characters, but also the audience that's watching the movie. And then ghosts and spirits, uh, just it's always like it's really creepy to see those things. Like you said before, you don't prefer child actors in horror movies, but I counter that by saying that children, they're typically you'd expect them to be like really like easygoing and like jovial and happy. But when you see a child in a horror movie, it's very creepy because that's them out of their element. They're not, especially if they're the evil one that's encapsulating the horror. Like for example, the Shining scene with those two creepy twins, or Sinister 2, where the twin brother is being, I guess, taken over or melded into being this little encapsulation of evil by the, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, the evil doer in the movie. You don't expect it, and it's creepy, and made even creepier by just how weird it sounds.
Right.
Yeah.
Can I just drop in a little bit there on Sinister? Because I think you touched on something that it doesn't nullify what I'm saying about child actors in horror movies, but it does point out what I like versus I don't like. Sinister 2 was a good movie, but it did something that frequently doesn't happen in horror movies. It gave the kid a pretty bad ending. Now, I think one kid, if I remember right, gets out alive and scot free, but the kid that goes insane gets dragged into the video at the end of the movie. And that for me is one of the reasons why kid actors in these movies usually don't work. It becomes a storyline where the adults are supposed to protect the kids, and the stakes are not high for the kid because in most cases, the movie isn't going to have the guts to give the kid a bad ending, which takes out most of the stakes.
T-
Um, and that's my primary complaint about child actors in these movies. It's not about the actors themselves. It's about it. To me, it significantly lowers the stakes. But I'm sorry to cut in on you there.
No, and you're right because most of the time you will not expect a child to either be like killed in a horrific way or a lot of terror or horror to befell them. They're typically safe, so it kind of takes back a lot of the tension that could be there, whether if it was like say an adult. And in Sinister 2, you had the possessed like twin who was supposed to kill his family to be, I guess, accepted by the sinister evil guy. And then he failed because his other brother caught on, and that's just the bad ending like you're talking about. Um, so let's move into, I guess, for a shitty transition, let's move into artsy horror. So where do you stand on this, Winter?
So, just so everyone's aware, I picked artsy horror as a topic header, and it might be because I have some grievances with the genre in general, and I wanted to get them out there. I don't find critical darling horror movies tend to go very well for me. When I say that, I think of movies like The Witch, Hereditary, Midsummer, which again, the last two movies are done by the same director. It Follows and Mama. Um, I know, Aegis, you had thought of a very good example of an artsier, more well crafted movie that came out recently that was good. But to me, these movies really are reaching out for awards. They're reaching out to get the critics, and they're also trying to bring in people to the horror genre that aren't necessarily fans of the horror genre, which, as I said before, with a movie like The Shining, I don't mind that. But I find all of these movies very slow, very dull, and again, very glossy. I would say that especially with something like Midsummer. The whole movie had just this overarching vibe of it felt very Hollywood. It felt very pretty, and it had a very mean spirited ending that I feel like the entire movie's point was building to. And it was a worthwhile topic. I'm not going to hop into it too far here today, but the entire movie was building into a topic point, and that became the end of the movie. And it was very mean spirited. And I went to see that movie with four people, and two people walked out really liking it and two people walked out hating it. And to me, it wasn't horror. It was trying to get a point across, and it got that point across, but it gave up the scares to do it. And it in exchange for the fairly slow burn that it had a few very gruesome scenes, especially closer to the end, um, that to me felt unearned. And it was the same as Hereditary. you you had this movie that was so slow, and so many people praised it because it was supposedly building up the dread, but to me it was more focused on the visuals and the characters speaking back and forth, which is good in the movie, but I don't know, it felt too slow. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, exactly. Like to your point, it sounds like these movies that are artsy almost have like a political statement underlying the entire movie. Would you say?
Yeah, they do. And again, a lot of horror movies do have political statements. Again, I know that you have a sample that you're waiting to discuss, and I would agree with you on the point that that was a good horror movie. Um, but an example of a movie that almost had a point to make, even though I think its point kind of got lost in translation, is It Follows. When I watched that movie, um, it made me very uncomfortable as a person. It was very obviously intended to be an STD AIDS type movie, where it could be anyone that you've slept with, anyone that you have encountered, any past person they slept with, and it stalks you down and slowly kills you, and you spread it on to the next person you give it to. It was an allegory, but the thing is the actual horror in it was not scary. It had a few visual scenes, like the scene with the girl in the headlights at the very beginning, that were horrifying. Otherwise, you had a very slow moving, very human looking creature that just wasn't scary. And to be honest, I feel like it was a little mean spirited. A lot of people live with STDs, and I'm not 100% sure what the point the movie was trying to get across about them was, besides vilifying people that have them. And I could be wrong about that, but that was what I got out of that movie. It was vilifying people who have STDs. It made it so they were all trying to give it to other people. It made it so that they were all trying to make it so people couldn't tell who gave it to who. I'm sure that wasn't the point of the movie, but that's what I took away from it. It made me very uncomfortable, and not in a good way. And I would say that was the way Midsummer made me feel too. Its point that it got across could be taken like three different ways, and a few of them were really uncomfortable in not great ways. Um, but you have a good example, so I'll let you go ahead and talk about the good example of an artsier movie.
I actually have two. So they're both made by Jordan Peele, and one is Us, and the other is Get Out. Now, Get Out, on the surface, it feels like it's like a social commentary on like black people and white people, and in the movie, it boils down to uh, upper class white families basically enslaving or like mind manipulating black people to be like their little butlers and their servants essentially. And this couple, specifically the boyfriend, finds this out and he escapes. Now, the cool thing was you're trying to almost like dissect what the story is as it's going on, who are the key players, who is the bad guy, what's going on. you're basically discovering the story as the boyfriend is discovering the story. So it was creepy. It was nice to just like to discern and understand the sinister aspects of the White family and the girlfriend's family, and also get into the minds of those people that believe that they're doing right when in fact they're doing a lot of wrong. Um, that's what I would probably less define as a horror movie, more of like a thriller slash mystery. And I feel like that's a big thing with some horror movies. Like they're less horror in some classical senses, like psychological, and more so it's like a bit of mystery, or like a really thriller, intense, or like just that kind of thing. Now, Us, that's another one I would define as more like mystery thriller, maybe a little bit of horror elements in it, but it really felt mysterious because have you seen Us first off?
I have seen Us. I've seen both the movies that you're talking about, and I agree with you that they're good. But I figured I'd let you play good cop in this scenario.
It's easier that way. Yeah, so it's kind of cool because you want to learn like why is there basically a clone family of our main protagonists, and then as you slowly weave your way through the story, you get to the end and you realize the clone family, or what appears to be the clone family, is actually the real family at the end, and the ones that are above ground are the fakes, and it's cool to like discover that.
I agree. And one of the things about Jordan Peele's movies is that even though there's that political vein to them, they don't let up on the tension. They don't let up on the plot. And that was one of the things I found about some of these more artsier horror movies is they're almost intentionally vague, and it doesn't it isn't welcoming is the only way I can describe it. Like Hereditary again was very much praised. I saw a lot of critics saying they would want to have to go back and watch it 2 or 3 times to figure out the plot. Well, I think the plot was pretty straightforward. The grandmother was in a cult. There was a demon that preferred males to, I don't, I guess, take over the males, and it passes on from person to person. However, the movie wants to just bury that. It wants to make it so complicated and make it seem so smart that it only shows you certain things through a character flipping pages in a book, a character flipping over images of the grandmother. And because of that, the movie really didn't have that complicated or intelligent of a plot, but it made itself feel more important than it was. It made itself feel like a conversation piece when it wasn't. And yet, you have movies like Donnie Darko and Inception that pull off that more vague, not lack of plot, but more you don't quite know how it's working and actually manage to pull it off in an interesting way. Whereas to me, Hereditary, it just seemed like it was intentionally vague. And even then, the basic plot, once you figured it out, was not complicated. I see you wanted to say something on that, Aegis.
Yeah, I mean, just your point of having like a critic say they have to watch it 2 or 3 times to actually understand the plot. Uh, Most people aren't going to do that, and so if you're making your story that complicated, you're probably going to lose your viewer by halfway through. Because I found this isn't horror, but when I was watching the movie Tenet by Christopher Nolan, I almost had to play catch up and quickly try and understand things that I didn't understand earlier in the movie that were now developing later in the movie. Doesn't help that time travel is wonky in a movie anyways, but that's just one example of if it's not clearly or somewhat clearly illustrated to the audience what's going on or the plot in a convincing way, you can almost lose them because they're trying to understand it as more the movie's going on.
Right, and yet you have a movie like Donnie Darko, which I know if we ever get viewers, they're going to say Donnie Darko is not that complicated either. But if you watch Donnie Darko very carefully, you can kind of figure out the plot, and it is interesting. Just like if you rewatch Fight Club, you can see all the hints and warnings that the main character is gasp, actually one person. Sorry for that spoiler if anyone hasn't watched that movie at this time. Um, but with me, again, it's just I find when you bring the artsier side in, you bring some of the good because you get more professional, more famous actors in the movies. You get better scene structure, and you get things like that. But to me, very often they're overwhelmed by the urge to make it seem more important than it is. They tend to forget it is just a movie. Needless complication of a very simple plot. Um, and intentionally uncomfortable, in my opinion, in a bad way type movies. Again, maybe I should go a little more into depth with Midsummer. I don't know, Aegis. Have you seen it?
Uh, no, I actually haven't seen Midsummer, so you're going to be the sole person to actually drive this conversation, aside from me chipping in
Right.
my 2 cents.
So the movie deals with assault, and it deals with recovery in a European. I don't honestly, I don't remember what country exactly it was based in, but a group gets together. They go, and if I remember right, the main character's parents had died. And I forget, I might be getting it wrong at this point whether she was assaulted. I might actually have that wrong. But near the end of the movie, it's building in that this community kind of uses male ego and male stupidity to get what they want. And I don't want to spoil anything too much for anyone, but I want to get my point across. Um, and it seems like it's intentionally controversial because it builds its point well. The males in the movie are easily misled, they're easily duped by things that are going on, while some of the female characters seem to draw back and be like, something seems really wrong here. And I just want to remind everyone, it's been a while since I've seen this movie, but the way the movie ends is basically the male character, the male lead, gets drugged and not forced, but he gets drugged into a hallucinogenic sex scene that technically results in him cheating on his girlfriend. And she allows him to die. In fact, she selects him to die. I don't know if his punishment is a fair word, but because she has to pick someone and she's so angry with him, she selects him to get burned to death. And I can't remember quite what the buildup was, but the movie made a very good point throughout the entire movie. And again, I forget if the female lead, I feel like she was assaulted at some point, but I don't remember. But it made a very good allegory for things about male ego. Males being misled by thinking with their second brain and things like that. But at the end, it became so mean spirited. This guy was technically assaulted himself. And I think it was intentionally left to be vague whether or not this was justice for what he had done. And I don't, I don't know that that needs to be something that's in a horror movie because it upset me, but not in I'm an intrigued way. It upset me like I was looking at my friends and being like, am I actually going to talk about this topic with my friends after I finish watching this movie? Um, and I think it did it intentionally. I think it meant to make 50%, 60% of the audience think one thing and the other 40 to 50% think the other thing, and intentionally cause division in the way it presented things because it was left somewhat vague how you were supposed to feel about it. But it was such a hot button issue that it's not something you really want to go to a theater with your date or someone or a friend and walk out completely divided on your mentality on what it was supposed to be saying. Um, and I don't know. I like a horror movie with plot, but to me, that movie came off as very mean spirited. Um, so I think I'll leave it at that. I think we've kind of touched base on the entire topic quite well. Do you want to get into preferred perspectives and preferred types of characters in movies?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. So for me, it actually I feel like it depends largely on the movie and the context of the movie. Like for instance, It and Annabelle Creation. They're largely child focused and child driven. With It, for instance, you see your characters be really overcome with fear, and Pennywise actually taking on the form of things that the children fear. Whereas in Annabelle Creation, you have this creepy doll, and children in the house uncover the doll, and things start to really become a lot creepier. It affects the children as well as the adults in the house, but it's largely child focused. I think children in horror movies, they're easier to kind of prey on because they're more fearful of a lot more simpler things. Uh, that's kind of where I was thinking. But adults, you know, you can have a lot more mature themes and gorier themes because, adults are more likely, I guess, in these uh, theoretical circumstances to be subjected to them. You won't see a child be glorified or, ripped apart, but you'll see an adult because it's more accepting and less disturbing. It's still disturbing, but it's not quite as disturbing as if a child was, mauled. What about you?
I like a lot of horror movies. I can delve into things like slasher movies where I actually like the final girl trope, even though I think one of the best examples of the final girl struggle for survival is Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator. Um, However, I also think of movies like The Descent, where you build up that there's just this powerhouse of an enemy, whether it be spiritual, whether it be a slasher, whether it be a monster, and you get whittled down from, say, 10 characters to two or one, and you have to see them work out how exactly am I going to stop this. I've always enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the side of it that presents it as humans can overcome things, but I've also enjoyed it because you get to actually see why this thing is a threat throughout the entire movie, and it makes you understand quite forcefully just how much that character is overcoming to survive. I think in, say, modern hero movies, very frequently you don't get to see the threat of the enemy because they don't want to risk killing anyone in a movie, or they don't want to risk having the hero look too bad with the villain. So I think I enjoy that in horror movies where you actually get to see the threat of a villain and have one person fight their way to survive. You had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, it's just to that point. It's kind of nice to see your heroes be whittled down because it lets you know the threat is real and is threatening. But it's nice to see your heroes also like develop ways to combat that threat and that evil and overcome it by the movie's end.
Right. So you're not going to like my second point of view that I enjoy. I really enjoy villains as the protagonist. I think they call them deuteragonists when it's a villain. I and people who watch this channel will eventually figure out I love human psychology. So for me, I love a movie that places me in the mind of a bad guy. Think the TV show You on Netflix, where the character is so warped that he believes he's a perfect gentleman when really he's a complete monster. And you start off seeing things from his perspective, so he almost seems sympathetic until you start to get to know this character, and then it's like, ooh, okay, there's something very wrong with you. And unfortunately, Aegis, you did warn me before we started this that you have not seen that show. I'd highly recommend it. It's a great example of a villain as the protagonist in a way that lets you have a deep dive into basically their broken psyche. Speaking of Psyche, I also like Psycho and the Devil's Rejects. Um, Again, American Psycho is about Christian Bale's character. If you want to see Batman run naked down a hallway with a chainsaw chasing somebody, watch this movie. It's great because at the end of the movie, you're not even 100% sure if he did the things that he showed you throughout the movie. He's an unreliable narrator to the point where it's almost comical. He takes up the name of another male character in the movie that he idolizes, and he hates at the same time. And the movie just gets so mind bending that you're not 100% sure what is his fantasy and what is his real life. I find it fascinating. I also find it fascinating that he is clearly some form of a sociopath or a psychopath, but by the end of the movie, you realize he might not be. He has convinced himself he is this emotionless creature, and after all of the actions that he thinks he's done, he starts to have a bit of a mental breakdown. I really enjoyed it. Devil's Rejects, again, that's pure psychopathy. These characters are not redeemable. Do not let anyone under, say, 16 watch this movie. It's very R-rated. It's very gruesome, but it really lets you see what these warped people in this movie find fun. Um, it's truly disgusting. It's one of the few horror gore porn movies that I truly enjoyed, even though it also made me feel disgusted to a level. But I enjoy those kind of movies. What about you?
Hey, sorry about that. So, I mean, it's funny you mentioned like the bad guy as the main POV. Like, if you look at something that's not horror, you look at Joker. Joker, in the movie Arthur, he he's a little different. He's beaten down by society, beaten down by the man. He's got some issues. You are sympathetic for the villain because Joker is ultimately a villain, and it kind of twists it into making you feel bad for Arthur and ultimately feeling sympathetic for the person, the main POV in the movie. But he's ultimately a bad guy who does bad things and goes on to do even worse things.
Well, we assume if he again, it's one of those movies where the narrator is so unreliable that you're not even 100% sure he did all the things he claims he's done throughout the movie. Um, so yes, I agree. Joker was a great example. Good movie. Now, what about you? You have a very different perspective on me about this, don't you? When it comes to preferred types of characters.
Yeah. Well, like I said earlier, I like child-focused like movies because if you have a child bad guy, it's creepy because obviously the child is going to be possessed by some evil or some demon. And like I said earlier in our discussion, children, you don't expect them to be in that evil light. You expect them to be jovial, happy, like go lucky, like prancing around. You don't expect them to be like these mature, like in these mature situations where it's can be evil or deceptive or spiritually malevolent. You know, it's takes the child out of its typical element and makes you almost on your back foot because you don't expect to see what they're going to do next. And uh, like I said earlier, like it with the child actors, I think it largely depends on how good of an actor the children are. Because I mean, a lot of times, if you think of, I think of Star Wars Episode One, Anakin's child actor. He was at fault partially because of the script, but also I don't think he was a spectacular child actor. So it kind of almost takes you out of the element because they're not very believable in their situation.
But child actors have also gotten a lot better in recent years. And I know that's led to some controversy because people know that the reason they're getting better is they're getting put through a lot of ridiculous training. But I would say with something like Stranger Things or it's a product of a generation of child actors who are actually better at acting. Would you agree with that?
100%, yeah. Just like Stranger Things is a great example of a good TV show with good child actors, good setting, good story, and nice adult characters that they're not even really the focus, but they're there to help shore up anything that is weak in the narrative.
Absolutely. And I can understand that. I mean, as I said, I have a lot of horror movies that I like. There's no one genre where I hate every horror movie I've ever seen in it. Um, but definitely the ones that are child focused tend to be weak in my perspective. They tend to be weaker. Is there any other perspectives that you enjoy that maybe we can meet in the middle on?
Well, have you seen the movie Dreamcatcher?
A long, long time ago. You're gonna have to catch me up on the plot very quickly before you dive in.
So it's been a while for me too, but I think it's a Stephen King book, and it's essentially these friends. They have this friend who I think is a little mentally challenged, but over the course of the story, the characters are slowly picked off by this Lovecraftian beast, and by the end they overcome it. And I think that was a decent narrative with adult focused actors.
Right, and I think we're finding out here that both of us have a thing for Stephen King. For me, it's definitely because Stephen King tends to like to analyze the human psyche. I'm not sure what draws you to it, but you do seem to like a lot of Stephen King.
Well, Stephen King, as well as weaving like good horrific narratives, he also gives you great character development because a lot of times in Stephen King's movies and books, it goes beyond just the simple horror elements. You actually become really invested in the characters and their plights and their issues, right?
Yeah, and he's a great promotional person for Maine. It's unbelievable. I was reading The Institute, his newest book, and for about 150 pages, he managed to avoid having the topic be set in Maine, and I was quite impressed until suddenly the book was set in Maine. However, I'm not going to go too much into my qualms about that. You wanted to discuss horror TV and what makes it good, what makes it bad. I think I'll let you take it off on this one since I started last year.
Sure. So I think two big ones that come to mind for horror TV are The Sinner and Stranger Things. Now, The Sinner, I've only really seen the first season. That show, it started off with a little bit of like horrific element because the wife is at the beach with her husband and her family, and she kills her husband because at the time you have no idea why. It's a random act of rage, and it's horrific. The husband is brutalized, and over the course of the season, you uncover the mysteries behind why it happened. I think this one is less horror based and more thriller mystery, like I was touching on earlier. But the story is a little like captivating. You then become interested in the characters over the course of the run, specifically the detective, and I can't remember his name. But for Stranger Things, that's almost like a Stephen King feeling TV show. It's set in the 80s. It's got great character development. It's got Lovecraftian elements. It's got creepy government organizations and controlling children and like superpowers, which is I guess where the fiction aspect comes into play as well as the Lovecraftian elements. But for the first two seasons of that show, I really enjoyed it. I didn't watch season three because I heard it really stepped down in quality, both narratively and maybe even like budget wise. I'm not sure about that last one, but I'd like to stick with the first two seasons, mainly even season one, because at the end of season one they overcome the evil, and at the end of season one, the final scene you see is the young boy in the front of the mirror, and it's like a tease that the evil, like the Lovecraftian evil, is still there and just cuts to black. What about you?
Right, and I would agree with you. Part of what TV series seem to need to balance is keeping the horror consistent and steady, but not having it so upfront and constant that it's always needing to one up itself. I think that's why a lot of horror TV shows tend to trail off even after one season. I'm thinking even The Exorcist on Netflix, a show that to me started off fairly promising. It had steady horror. It had scenes that were dread-inducing, and it took its time. Unfortunately, like you said, after a season or two, it tapered off. You got to the point where it was dealing with the entire Vatican was corrupted by demons, and the very few cardinals left who weren't possessed were having to resist it, and it was an underground resistance against all the demons who had already taken over. It got corny, I guess, is what I was going with. It got to the point where it was like, okay, this is silly. And then you have shows like The Haunting of Hill House, where the horror was done really well. It was done steadily throughout the season. The Hanged Woman was horrifying in a lot of levels. I don't like the concept of waking up in bed with someone hovering over me. I think that's probably one of my most deep-seated fears about ghosts is I'll find out they're real waking up with one staring at me.
Kinky.
Um, what? Is that your way of saying you want to say something?
That's my little easing in there. No, I was just gonna say the issue with TV shows is it's a similar issue that plagues a lot of horror movies that go on for too long. Eventually you have to almost keep one-upping yourself and making the horror even more horrifying, or the events and the tragedies more over the top, where it feels like it is cheesy, and like we're gonna touch on next, jumping the shark.
Right. And then you have the opposite problem. Shows that take it too slow because they're trying to save their scares. And the second half of my point was The Haunting of Manor, the sequel to the first show, The Haunting of Hill House. It took it too slow. You can tell it's trying to save its more horrifying scenes for later episodes. And when you eventually get there, they're decent. They are. It has a moment, I don't know if you've seen the show yet, but let's just say with someone gets choked out of nowhere and it genuinely catches you off guard. Um, However, the first three or four episodes had almost no horror whatsoever. And I guess it was an interesting show, but to me, it almost pulled its punches for too long. That by the time it got to the climax, I just didn't care. Half the time, the reason I got by jump scares was because I was barely watching the show anymore. And I don't think that's the direction they wanted to go.
I think
Um,
just one thing, Winter. I think it's an issue that I don't know if you've watched The Walking Dead. I watched the first five seasons, and it started off really strong. And then I felt over time it got dragged out too long, and it was very slow. And then the last like 5 to 10 minutes of the episode was really like intense, and then it would give you a good like snippet of like a trailer for the next episode, and then the next episode started off the exact same way, uh, and it really like cut into the pacing. And I think that's what makes a good horror TV show as well as a good horror movie, like we've touched on many times. Pacing, keeping you constantly invested without, lulls in the activity or in the plot.
Yeah, and you're right, because while we all want character development, you don't, especially in horror, you don't necessarily want the character development to cut off the tension, because if you ever feel bored in a horror movie, it's probably making you less scared. One example I can think of, and people are going to scream at me because I know these aren't that developed of characters, was the newest Friday the 13th, the remake. The characters were the stereotype. I think they were supposed to be low 20s, but I would say still the stereotype teenage concept. But most of them had a little more depth to them, a little more entertainment value, and you felt a little bit worse when Jason inevitably cut their way through them. And it balanced switching back and forth between scaring you with some entertaining, funny character moments. I'm thinking there was a scene on a lake. Have you seen the movie before? Before I go
No,
too
I
far.
haven't, but I'm assuming the lake is where I forget the name of the lake. Not
Yeah, Crystal Lake.
Crystal Lake. Thank you.
Yes. So there's a scene, and I'm not even sure if the scene is on Crystal Lake now that you mention it, but I would assume it was Crystal Lake, where there's a girl skiing behind a boat. And of course, these movies all don't want me to ever water ski again. And the boyfriend gets hit by an arrow while he's dragging her around. And when she falls in the water, she thinks he's coming back for him or for her, and the boat just hits her instead. And you're watching this intense scene fold out, but then it's balancing that with a bit of character development of other characters. It keeps the tension up because you know there's actually time gaps between when she gets hit by the boat and when you find out she's still alive and she's trying to get to shore. But it does it well enough that you're not dropped out of what's happening on the water or with the other characters who are in the cabin. And I find that is a good plot development. At the same time, Friday the 13th, the again the remake, had probably the most brutal, unrelenting first 15 minutes I've ever seen in a horror movie. I don't care what anyone says, whether they think it's a good movie, bad movie. If you weren't stunned by those first 15 minutes, you're lying. Um, when I saw it in theater, it was a full theater. It was one of the first few days that had come out. I was down in Florida, and that opening scene got a standing ovation because it was relentless. It did not let up throughout the entire 15 minutes. And yet, the characters were interesting. They only got 15 minutes of screen time, but they were interesting characters up until they were all dead. Um, but I don't really have a segue. Let's hop to our last topic. We're running in at about 45 minutes now. Let's talk jumping the shark in the horror genre. You go first, Aegis.
Okay, the first movie that sticks out to me as a series jumping the shark is Jason X for the Friday the 13th series. So, when Jason is obliterated on Earth, where do you take him next? I tell you where you take him. You take him to motherfucking space. You put him on a spaceship and you put him in like 300 years in the future. And if that is not cheesy and grasping at straws for plot development, I don't know what it is. It's a fun movie to watch, but man, it's such a departure from just the classic Jason like gore fest. And not even that. It's so weird to see like a robot face off against Jason. And then when you think Jason's dead, oh no, just wait. They've got nanobites or little liquid metals that can flow into Jason and make new body parts. And now he's Jason reborn. Come on. That's such
I
bullshit.
I honestly forgot that happened, but you're right. I have a question before we carry on. Are we swearing now?
Oh yeah, we're swearing. Just maybe we'll keep it a little dialed back, but that's just it felt like it added there.
Okay, well, gosh darn, I don't mind swearing. Um,
Okay, Ned
so yeah,
Flanders.
I okay. Well, I would agree. Horror movies that tend to go on forever, long-term genres tend to eventually jump the shark a bit. I'm thinking, say, for the Saw series, when I don't even remember which one it was, but when you had two characters waking up attached to a literal table saw, and then the woman is strapped on over top, and there's like a literal crowd of people coming to watch this horror porn, gore porn fall out. Um, I thought that was a moment in the series where Saw jumped the shark. I don't think the movie's quite recovered from that to me. And I feel like Saw was a good example of why jumping the shark happens, because the first movie was very low key, very low budget, very gritty, and the next movie still had it. And then the first, I think, 4 or 5 movies managed to develop a fairly interesting plot. But then they wanted to go on forever. They wanted to rake in the box. And the plot went from interesting to convoluted to okay, there's no way anyone was actually planning this from the start. And at the same time, the traps had to become more and more complicated, more and more fascinating, and more unrealistic in order to keep one upping the traps before and keeping people's interests.
And
And eventually,
disgusting. It got increasingly grosser as the series went on, I think.
but that's the thing is, I didn't find it got grosser because I found the more and more money it got thrown at it by big Hollywood, the gore became more and more polished, and to me that was less and less realistic. The first movie's grimy, grungy, gruesome, but doesn't show you everything. Sense of horror was more gruesome than what was the new one called? The new one was I think just called Jigsaw.
It was just
And,
Jigsaw.
yeah, and it was to the point where it literally looked like a glossy action hero movie in its aesthetics, and I found it didn't get in my head like the other ones did.
So,
um
so when I say gross though, I don't mean like the gore was disgusting. I just mean like the traps that people were involved in. I think of Saw 3D or Saw 3, sorry, where you have this young man who's in this big like device, and the longer it takes for the person to get the key to release him, his limbs get twisted and then basically just ripped out of their sockets, and then last is his head. That's nasty. I
I agree.
and like Saw 2, I can remember seeing Saw 1. I was like 13 or 14, and thinking, "Oh, this is a good movie. It's not even that scary." And when I was younger, I absolutely hated horror movies. They scared the hell out of me. I was a bit of a puss, but that's another story for another time. But I remember thinking, "Oh, we can see Saw 2." We went to see Saw 2, and what did it for me was, if you recall, one of the druggy girls, they're trying to get this antidote to make themselves like get better again because they're locked in this house and they are all poisoned.
I
And
don't like needles. You're about
no,
to go off the rails, and I don't like needles, so feel free to talk. I'm going to cover my ears.
it's not the needle trap. So do you remember when the girls are
Oh,
just so disoriented and she sees like the needle and it's up in this device and you have to stick your hands up into it past the knives. And
yes, I also don't like wrist wounds. You're doing this to me on purpose. I really don't like wrist injuries. All right, continue.
I remember just covering my eyes and ears in the movie, so I was like, oh my god, she's gonna cut off her hands trying to get the thing. She's gonna cut off her hands. And that's when I was like, I gotta leave. I gotta get in here. I didn't get out, but I was ruined for the rest of the movie.
Yeah, and those movies did it with almost a gritty realism. You could believe that some lunatic designed a glass box for someone to stick their hand into that would serrate them as they cut through it. You believe someone could fill a pit with needles, whether or not they were actually dirty needles or just made to look dirty, or if he stole them from a hospital, which would be disgusting.
Ugh.
You could believe a psychopath could do that. And yet, when you got to the later Saw movies, you had these. I remember one of them had like a big cyclone blade that spun based on a motorcycle engine.
That's
And
Jigsaw.
oh, that was Jigsaw. Okay, good example then. It got to the point where it was like, could a guy with cancer who is barely able to stand up actually design these? Oh, wait, could one of his 20 accomplices we didn't know about design them?
Yep.
Maybe if they had 10 years. Um, but it got to that point where it was like, these aren't realistic. And yet, one of the most famous traps in the later movies that actually worked was simple. It was the carousel where 6 people
Mm.
were loaded onto it, and 4 of them were going to get hit with a shotgun bullet.
Yep.
It was simple, it was brutal, and it was effective because it brought back the realistic character fear in a realistic setting. Um, Another genre.
One more gross trap before we go on to the next genre. Do you remember in Saw 3D where the buddy he lied about actually getting out of Jigsaw's trap, and he was proclaiming himself as like a hero, and
Hmm.
Jigsaw actually said, you know what, frig you, you're going into one of my traps. And one of his lawyers actually was in this like device which it moved forward slowly. And just before I go on, I hate anything to do with eyes. This chick was getting moved forward, and there was like these three like sharp cut pipes, and if
I
you
do
didn't
remember that.
and if you didn't do the activate the trap in time, the pipes would go through her eyes and through her mouth out her back of her head. Ugh. So they do get clever, but they're also still kind of gross. Maybe too clean, but still gross nonetheless.
Yep. Well, all right. Let's cut away from gross. You've scared my mental capacity for the next few days. So let's talk about Paranormal Activity. Yes, I will defend the original Paranormal Activity. Again, I don't consider myself a horror snob. I will watch any horror movie. The original Paranormal Activity worked very low budget. It used camera work that most of us would believe could happen. It kept the ghosts in the background. You never saw them. And the scenes had this slow built up intensity. And then you have the ghost dimension, I believe, was the one where you literally see like a hole in the wall that leads to the ghost realm. And then there's another one in the later paranormal activities where this girl, and it was actually better than the other ones. It was like a young teenage woman who was the lead, and she was constantly on camera on her computer. Um, and it was one of the better ones for a while. It had some intense images, but then the end got so over the top because she gets lured into this cult house, and there's like 100 of them in the backyard. And again, these movies started off with such a simple premise that worked so well, but because they pumped out 5 billion of them, they had to keep coming up with new ideas that eventually just came off as silly. And that's where I find the jumping the shark happens is when you're constantly challenging a director, a writer, a producer to come up with a new scenario with the same general plot, eventually something really dumb is going to happen. Do you agree with that?
It almost gets beaten to death because like how many times can you basically retell the same story? Like I think of Halloween, like Michael Myers, he's come back time and time and time and time and time and time again. Like it's not believable. It goes on for too long. It's just like when should the villain just be killed for good? Aside from just like a straight up cash grab, I'll argue the Rob Zombie remakes are really good in both character development, but also in just reintroducing the Halloween movies. I think he only did two, and I remember really liking the first one. But just those are an example of like when it's redone, it can be done right and maybe done better than the old one.
Yeah, and I think the newest movie did a good job of bending the plot in a way that was interesting. Have you seen the newest one? Am I gonna have to spoil another movie to talk to you about it?
Oh, this is the one where Jamie Lee Curtis came back, right?
Yes.
I think it's
Am I
been like
going?
over a year or two. You can talk about it. I can't remember, but it was a decent movie. It wasn't crazy good, but it was meh decent.
No, because I want to say it it did what I find a lot of the artsier horror movies failed to do in their over the top premise. It showed Jamie Lee Curtis as a woman who had been attacked and abused by a male, the Shape, Michael Myers, for the people who don't call him that, and it twisted the plot on its head in an interesting way. It cut out, I think, everything except the second Halloween, and it called the rest of them nothing. It pretended they didn't exist and they weren't canon, which worked for me. And then it built in that she was preparing. She had been training with guns. She'd been training with weapons. She'd been training in hand-to-hand combat. She was seen as delusional by other people because of her paranoia induced by being scarred for life. It built all those things in a way that felt natural. It felt real. And when it eventually came time for her to kick the ever-loving heck out of Michael Myers, see, I didn't swear there. It worked because it felt like she was getting even with him. It was entirely justified, and she earned her win in a way that was believable. And it almost took that original ending scene from the first Halloween and it made her the Shape. It made her stalk him down. I thought it was very well done. I don't necessarily know if I thought burning the house down um, was the exact ending I would have gone with. However, I do understand that when you're dealing with someone like Michael Myers who feels like he won't die, it might be better to just light the house on fire and walk away. But yeah, I thought it proved that horror movies could tackle things like trauma without being preachy and without getting in your face and without intentionally being as controversial as they can be. It tackled a tough topic, and it dealt with how society looked at her. They saw her as a freak, they saw her as a point of interest, and it showed that she was reasonably paranoid, reasonably scarred, and reasonably well equipped to take care of the guy if he ever came back. I thought it was well done.
Nope, it sounds like it was good. I don't remember the movie, but you're ringing a lot of bells right now.
Do we want to end on a positive note, or do we want to end on a cliffhanger that I'm actually behind you right now, Aegis?
Let's end on a good note. Something a little more positive since we're talking about horror and gore and death.
Okay, well then I brought ice cream and I'm behind you, not the knife that I have behind my back.
Ah, what kind of ice cream?
All right, I don't have ice cream, so I was
Damn it.
like, let's cut at that.
Damn it.
Hey, you wanted to end on a good note, but you wouldn't let it happen.
That's a disappointing note. Damn it.
All right, guys. We will be back. Just wanted to give you a quick update on our schedule. In the next few weeks, we're going to touch on video games again. We're going to talk about Halo Infinite and the release of Cyberpunk 2077 because there's nothing anyone likes more than jumping on a dead horse and kicking it 10 or 20 more times. But we want to talk about how Halo Infinite can avoid becoming Cyberpunk. We're also going to tackle a slightly darker topic on the week of January 24th to 31st, I believe, is the full week. We're going to join in with Bell Let's Talk. We believe it's an important topic right now to discuss things like depression and recovery. The world's in a difficult place. Society is in a divisive and difficult place. And while we don't want to dive into politics and things on this channel, we don't want to dive into too dark of topics. We do want to explore it in a way that we feel is appropriate. And to do so, we're going to talk about two albums that we both know and love. That would be Indestructible by Disturbed and We Are Not Your Kind by Slipknot. That way we can talk about these topics, but we can avoid getting into anything that might not be acceptable to YouTube standards. How do you feel about that, Aegis?
I think it's going to be a fun time during Bell Let's Talk week for us. Not the fact that it's going to be a fun week, but it's going to be an interesting time for us to actually dive into these albums because I don't know about you, when I was younger, I actually really just was guilty of just listening to an album, listening to the instruments, and not really trying to link together like the meaning behind the lyrics or the meaning in the song. So I'm going to be going back and revisiting those albums, and maybe it'll be a lot more eye-opening for me than just kind of like bounce my head up and down to The Night by Disturbed, or whether it be Torn, or you know, uh, oh, what's it called? Perfect Insanity, another good song. But what about you?
Well, you know me, I've always overanalyzed music, but I would love to take that journey with you. I think it would be quite interesting. I also remember, actually, before I get onto that, yeah, I think it would be good because Indestructible, a very brief statement on the topic. The album starts with a song about I know it's a military based song, but a man who feels indestructible presents himself to the world as very tough, very brutal, very unrelenting. And then the rest of the album presents individual songs that show why someone would put up that pretense and why someone would try to wall themselves off in that way. And it even ends on a song that clearly goes against the name of the album. The song's title is Facade. It's all fake. Whereas We Are Not Your Kind deals with depression that's been induced by relationships and been induced by alienation from society. I think they're important topics, and I would enjoy talking to you about those topics. With that being said, let's end on a bit of a lighter note because we promised we would. I know that you're thinking of doing a few gaming walkthroughs or a few gaming let's plays. Talk to me about that. Tell me what you're planning on doing.
I probably am gonna do a Destiny 2 raid along per se of the new raid Deepstone Crypt. Uh, I also am probably going to record some multiplayer gameplay from Halo Master Chief Collection on PC. I hope to God that I'm not brutal at PvP anymore. I'm kind of getting better again at Destiny 2 just because I haven't played PvP a whole lot in the last 6 to 12 months. But I used to really be good at Halo back when I was younger, and I'm hoping I can rekindle that and get back to being somewhat decent enough for some content. Other than that, I might record a little bit of maybe RuneScape and just talk about where the game is currently and hopefully where it's going to go in the next 6 to 12 months.
Are you going to let me eventually post up a compilation of my dumb moments on Call of Duty and Apex, or are we avoiding making me look bad in public?
Oh man, I do that anyway, so let's do that just for both of us.
All right, well then, guys, at some point I might be able to post up a compilation of moments in video games. Unfortunately, I don't have the setup right now to record a 1 hour stream, but I can save clips, and you won't even have to hear my voice. You can just watch what happens. So,
It's the
on
best
that
of
note,
both worlds.
exactly. So, on that note, you guys probably are tired of our voices for today. I want to wish you all a fantastic week and a good January. Aegis, do you have anything you want to say before we leave?
No, I think winter it's nice to get back into the swing of things with this, and I hope that we can keep up the momentum going forward and just hopefully you guys stick around for the ride.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.